So hello, everyone. My name's Kitty Sipple, and a little bit about myself. I am a white, queer, disabled, non-binary femme, and my pronouns are they, them. So when talking about me, please use they, them. I am American, and I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Currently, I am an undergraduate student at the University of Minnesota, and I am getting a multidisciplinary Bachelor of Science in Engineering Studies, Holistic Health and Healing, and Plant Biology, with a specialty focus in fungal biology. I am also a trauma and a sexual assault survivor. And I'm here to talk about disability, chronic illness, and the psychedelic experience. And as another accessibility note, I am making the entire text of my talk available at the end. So if you have any audio and processing stuff, you'll be able to actually access everything I'm saying online. So, I am mad, but not mad as in angry, mad as in madness. Madness is a concept that is well defined by many theorists and has been reclaimed by the Mad Pride movement. The Mad Pride movement is a mass movement of former and current mental health services users that have reclaimed the word mad as returning the power back to the neurodiversity of human consciousness. Madness is also connected to mental health conditions, and the term madness is often linked synonymously with insanity, mental instability, and most relevant to the psychedelic community, psychosis. And the idea of gatekeeping is the concept of limiting or controlling access to something. And really the most important takeaway of my entire talk, if you don't remember anything else, is that when we act as gatekeepers of madness, we also act as gatekeepers of healing. So, in discussing madness, it's also important to indicate how we talk about mental health. Mental health conditions are a type of chronic illness and disability. In 2016, roughly 34% of Americans in the US receiving disability assistance through Social Security were registered solely for a mental health condition. Our current mental health model needs to be redefined in order to create space for understanding the complexity of the human brain and its many forms of consciousness. Our existence with health is structured so that we are told what is normal. And if we don't meet that projection of normal, then we are othered. And if the definition of normal is just a projection, then the definition of healing is also just a projection. So it is my hope by the end of this talk that we as a community are inspired to rethink the way we approach healing through psychedelics to be more just and equitable for chronically ill and disabled communities. So currently, the psychedelic community is seeking legitimacy through the medicalisation model of psychiatry, an area of medicine that has systematically stripped the agency away from the people seeking help in that area of medicine. Psychiatry defines madness as psychosis, and it is deeply woven into the pathology of the many mental health conditions that psychiatry works with. Some of these conditions include schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and then all of the dissociative disorders. In many cases, these conditions that I just named are considered extreme, persistent, and severe. I love cats, that's why this is included. Psychosis is really just an altered state of consciousness, otherwise known as an ASC, which is a a phrasing that you've probably seen in other talks in the research data. And the way we talk about these lived experiences is important. Language is important. And so I'm invested in changing the narrative, and I'm very conscious about the language I use in talking about these things. So moving forward in this presentation, I will use the phrase altered state of consciousness to describe what psychiatry has pathologized as psychosis or a psychotic experience. And the idea of madness is a reclaimed idea that works to destigmatize the concept of altered states of consciousness. In the US, the Center for Disability Rights defines ableism as a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, and psychiatric disabilities, and often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or another. Coercive vulnerability strips people of their agency and reinforces ableism through its beliefs, support structures, and economic demands. And when we believe that people need to be fixed, it implies that we first believed that they were broken. So legitimizing psychedelic science research through psychiatry perpetuates the ableist belief that disabled people need to be fixed, and inadvertently dismisses the role that trauma has played in some of these conditions. So for many years, the professional mental health community had not considered the effects of trauma as a precursor for many mental health conditions that have altered states of consciousness as a symptom. This belief, thankfully, is changing. And professionals are finally acknowledging the devastating effects of trauma. Psychedelic research has shown successful interventions in the most well-known trauma-based condition, PTSD. MAPS is in phase 3 trials. And so we're working. And since the psychedelic community is already actively engaged in this type of research, it means that we are already directly involved with people who have lived experiences that include the many forms of altered states of consciousness. So psychedelics, as a basis, are chemical compounds that produce an altered state of consciousness that can be accompanied by auditory and/or visual hallucinations. It can include many other different elements, but those are the kind of two key things. Psychedelics could be viewed as a temporary and reversible altered state of consciousness. This means that they are performative. People who take psychedelics are performing madness, while mad people are living madness. Yet, we only accept one of these scenarios as normal. The psychedelic community plays into the stigma of gatekeeping madness by suggesting that someone who is already living in madness does not have the agency to participate voluntarily in another form of madness, even in a therapeutic environment. This strong advisory is rooted in the fear-based belief that people with these mental health conditions are too emotionally and mentally unstable to participate in the psychedelic experience. As a mad person, I believe they think psychedelics will hurt us, and they're trying to save us. Or potentially more accurate, trying to save themselves from us. But if we were to acknowledge the idea that someone could be mad and have agency over their altered states of consciousness, this community would be forced to admit that a person may also have additional skill sets to navigate the psychedelic experience, potentially even more so than someone who does not live in madness. Another cat. At this point, you might be asking yourself, why? Why is this important? Why am I giving a presentation on this? I'll do the big reveal. So I have dissociative identity disorder, otherwise known as DID, and formerly known as multiple personality disorder. It took over, let me just take a pause. I've never said that out loud to a group of people. So, thank you. So it took over 10 years to get that diagnosis. And before I received it, I was diagnosed as bipolar 1 disorder, that I had bipolar 1 disorder, that I had complex PTSD, and that I also had borderline personality disorder. And I was misdiagnosed for almost a decade and heavily medicated as if I had each of those conditions. And then my reality is, I live in a constant altered state of consciousness. More concisely, I hear voices. And I experience things around perception, identity, and general consciousness that other people really can't comprehend. But psychedelics saved my life. And I turned to them as a therapeutic intervention after being in psychiatric care for a decade with no successful alleviation of the distress in my life. I was at a crossroads of life or death, and I don't say that simply. And as a last resort, I turned to psychedelics. However, psychedelics did not cure my condition, as there is no cure. Psychedelics did increase my quality of life and gave me the ability to alleviate a lot of the distress in my life, the distress specifically around my symptoms. But I am just one example that people like me can benefit from the medicinal use of psychedelics. But I'm not special, because the reality is there are many people like me. The only difference is someone gave me a chance despite my condition. There it is. Okay, so toxic wellness culture has defined health and wellness as being cured of any illness or a purely asymptomatic existence. In order to feel better, you must get better. When someone indicates that they wish for you to get better, they're really stating that they wish you to be cured and asymptomatic, the quintessential perfect state of health. But curing isn't the toxic issue, because some conditions actually do have a cure. The toxicity falls on the belief that being sick without much distress and with a high quality of life is not considered as good enough or the same as a cure, and by research standards is not a viable treatment option. Psychedelic research has focused on treatments for conditions to produce an asymptomatic existence, but for some mental health conditions, there's no cure. In the case of dissociative identity disorder, I stated previously that there is no cure. The reality is, there's no effective cure. But the real question is, do I want to be cured? But potentially to your disbelief, the answer is no. I don't want to be cured of my symptoms. At this point, my symptoms are mostly not distressing, and my constant altered state of consciousness has been my lived experience my entire life. And frankly, I cherish it. But just because I don't want to be cured does not mean that I don't want to feel better. And if I can define my own healing, especially with psychedelics, then I can always feel better. So the first step to changing this belief around health is to realize that healing is not a binary existence of sick versus cured. Healing is a transit state, a process of coming and going which moves along a gradient. Healing is removing the distress of someone's lived narrative, even if temporarily, which allows for more space for skill sets around physical self-care, emotional self-care, and mental self-care to actually flourish. Healing is alleviating the suffering, but for some chronically ill and disabled people, we sometimes can't erase the pain. Healing is recognizing that even if there's no cure, we can ultimately feel better, and even while managing symptoms that may arise with our chronic illness and disability. Unfortunately, psychiatry exists in the binary healing narrative of sick versus cured, and really is not interested in reframing the idea that healing is a quality of life issue and not a symptom issue. Our community is trying to be an alternative part of psychiatry, when in fact we should just be trying to be an alternative to psychiatry. Psychedelics work to provide the space and recognition that where we are, where we start, we can always feel better, even if we don't meet society's standards of getting better or being cured. For me, psychedelics helped me to break through years of dissociative amnesia, otherwise known as blackout amnesia. And it gave me the gift of healing and feeling like living in this world was actually possible. I found clarity in my particular form of consciousness, and that allowed me to access memories of trauma that I was able to process in therapy. These medicines gave me the tool to alleviate my own suffering, and that I had experienced for 3 decades. And then they illuminated the points of my own resilience that society had constantly reinforced to me that I did not have. Psychedelics as a therapeutic intervention are usually not the first line of defense. They may come at the end of many failed and misguided treatment options that have proven to be unsuccessful and even more harmful than good. The belief that people who experience altered states of consciousness from certain mental health conditions and are too mentally unstable to do psychedelics directly removes the agency from these people, like myself, to actively participate in their own healing journey. This belief was directly adopted from the practice of psychiatry, and it's deeply rooted in fear and misinformation. This fear and misinformation will create an environment of exclusion. We are literally excluding people from alternative ways of feeling better and defining their own healing. In order to change, we must consider that there is an alternative. That people who experience chronic illness and disability that involve altered states of consciousness are fully capable of navigating the psychedelic experience, which is just another altered state of consciousness, and they are just not aware of their capability yet. The time has come for this community to facilitate this change without any judgment, fear, or exclusionary regulations. The reality is, psychedelic accessibility is a disability rights issue. I would also like to acknowledge that in North America, a lot of the pioneering work of disability rights activism, which has provided the space for disability justice work, which is what I'm talking about, was and continues to be done by communities of color, especially queer communities of color. So in order to move out of the space of fear that creates this environment of exclusion, the psychedelic community needs to step into being intentionally vulnerable. This requires a giant leap of faith. So what kind of leaps can we take? Kind of like this fish. I'm gonna pause. There's a lovely motorized. Okay. So what kind of leaps can we take? We can open research studies with populations that do not include exclusionary criteria for what are considered extreme mental health conditions, including bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, and any of the dissociative disorders, including dissociative identity disorder. We recognize that if we are actively creating viable treatment alternatives for populations suffering from trauma, that we have to address how we interact with disabled and chronically ill communities in terms of language and access. And most important, we have to lift up diverse voices of leaders, researchers, facilitators, and academics that are mad, disabled, and chronically ill. It's time to bring us into positions of leadership so that we can create the type of healing that we want, not the type of healing that you think we want. So, full transparency, I was very nervous to share my personal story at this conference. I was worried about being misunderstood in my own personal experience, disbelieved in my psychedelic advocacy, and most importantly, reinforced in the belief that I did not belong in these spaces. And unfortunately, my beliefs were confirmed. It's already happened. But deep down inside, I know these aren't truths, but these worries are fueled by the beliefs that still persist in this community and that we need to dismantle. So, for all my fellow mad, chronically ill and disabled people in this audience right now, this is for you. No more silencing our voices because someone may fear our wisdom. So I fully believe that psychedelic accessibility is the start of making this psychedelic community the future that I have always dreamed of, and the future that you have always dreamed of, and a future that has space for all of us. The concept of psychedelic accessibility inherently means making the before, during, and after the psychedelic experience accessible to all communities, especially marginalized communities who experience additional levels of vulnerability from society. Psychedelic accessibility requires us to move past the comfortable ideas of diversity and inclusion and step into the necessary and uncomfortable ideas of justice and equity. I say these are uncomfortable because it means that we have to face the inherent discrepancies and systemic oppression that white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, and neurotypical people have built. The systems of power that we have to dismantle. I believe that the psychedelic community can be different. We can create a new framework from a place of justice and equity. We don't have to rebuild the same frameworks of oppression that disabled, chronically ill, and mad people suffer endlessly under. Psychiatric care told me I was wrong and that I had to be fixed. I fully believed that if I couldn't be fixed, I didn't want to be alive. And I took a leap with psychedelics. And then I realized I was never actually broken. I just experienced madness, and that's my normal as a chronically ill and disabled person. So in order for psychedelics to thrive into this beautiful potential future that we all imagine, we have to stop being the gatekeepers of madness. Thank you.